And today, we're tackling a huge one, a subject that still casts this just massive shadow over everything from energy policy to politics. We're talking about the Chernobyl disaster. And our main source for this is Serhii Plokhy's incredible book, Chernobyl, The History of Tragedy. And this isn't just, a technical breakdown of an accident. It's really an investigation into the entire Soviet system.
That's the key thing to understand right from the start. Plokhy argues that this disaster was, well, almost inevitable.
Inevitable? How so?
Well, his research uses all this newly declassified material, even old KGB files. And what it shows is that you can't just blame the engineers or the reactor design. The real problem was the Soviet system itself.
Okay, so you're talking about the culture of secrecy, the constant pressure to hit quotas no matter what.
Exactly. That and this culture where being loyal to the party was often more important than actually knowing what you were doing. It was a system just riddled with fatal flaws.
And Plokhy's big argument, which we'll get into, is that this technological disaster ends up sparking a political revolution. It's the demand for truth about Chernobyl that really gives Gorbachev's policy of glasnost of openness its power.
And it directly fuels the collapse of the Soviet Union. So we're going to trace that story. We'll start in the control room on April 26, 1986. Then we'll move to the halls of power in Kiev and Moscow and see how the lies and denial unfolded.
And then we'll look at the legacy, which is still shaping Ukraine and the world today.
Right.
So let's start where Plokhy starts, with the preface. He calls it a personal journey to the zone. And it really sets up this bizarre modern reality of Chernobyl. He talks about visiting the exclusion zone with his guide, a woman named Vida.
And it's just fascinating who goes there now. He mentions these 4 tourists from Britain, and they weren't there because of Cold War history.
No, not at all. They were there because of video games.
Yeah, video games like STALKER, Shadow of Chernobyl, and Call of Duty. The abandoned city of Pripyat was a level in the game, and they wanted to see it in real life. It's this whole new kind of dark tourism.
It's strange to think about. And as they're driving in, they pass this massive, almost terrifying structure called the Duga, the Arch.
The Russian woodpecker. It was this huge over-the-horizon radar system. It was the Soviets' low-tech, brute force answer to Ronald Reagan's Star Wars missile defense initiative.
And that contrast says it all, doesn't it? They'd spend billions on a military project like that, but cut corners on safety for a civilian nuclear plant.
That's the Soviet paradox in a nutshell. Then they get to Pripyat, the city built for the 50,000 plant workers. Plokhy calls it a modern-day Pompeii.
But it's an inverted Pompeii.
Exactly. In Pompeii, the volcanic ash destroyed the buildings, but it preserved the forms of the people. In Pripyat, the buildings are still there. The schools, the apartments, that iconic Ferris wheel.
But the people are all gone, driven out by an enemy they couldn't even see, the radiation.
And it's like a time capsule of the communist era. You can still see the propaganda slogans on the walls. Inside this abandoned cinema, he finds a portrait of the head of the KGB, Viktor Cheprikov, that's almost perfectly preserved after 30 years.
A symbol of how the structures of control outlasted the system itself.
It really is, and it leads to this great little story. The tour guide, Vida, she's looking at the signs in the old supermarket in Pripyat, signs for meat, cheese, milk, and she's confused.
Because in the rest of the Soviet Union, you'd never see those things in a store. The shelves were always empty. Why would you need a sign for something you don't have?
Right. But Pripyat was different. It was a privileged city tied to the military-industrial complex. They actually had sausage and cheese. It was this little bubble of prosperity in a sea of shortages.
Which perfectly sets up that old Soviet joke Plokhy tells.
What about the radio?
Yeah. If you want to fill your fridge with food, plug the fridge into the radio outlet.
Because the radio was always telling you how great things were, how production was up, even while your fridge was completely empty. It was a system built on a lie.
And for Plokhy, this is all deeply personal. He wasn't just a historian studying this from afar. He lived less than 500 kilometers away in Ukraine.
And years later, he was diagnosed with thyroid inflammation, which is a classic sign of radiation exposure. It brings the story right home.
So the book's main argument is set up right there in the preface. The technological disaster was born from a sick political and economic system.
And the cover-up was so total, so insulting, that the public's anger became this unstoppable force. It fueled glasnost and gave the Ukrainian independence movement its moral fire. Those movements really began as ecological protests against Moscow's lies.
Okay, let's get to the night itself. The book really builds the tension here as we head into the control room. This is chapter 4, Friday night.
Right. It's Friday, April 25th, 1986. Pripyat is getting ready for the big May Day holidays. People are relaxed. But inside the plant, the pressure is on.
And we meet the plant director, Viktor Brokhanov. Plokhy paints him as this capable, overworked guy, but he's under the gun from Moscow.
Totally. He'd just been chewed out for falling behind schedule on building the next reactor, Unit 5. The message from the top was simple: speed up, no more delays, production over everything.
And that pressure leads directly to the accident. They were scheduled to do a safety test on the turbine generator of Unit 4.
It was supposed to be a routine test during a planned shutdown, but then they get a call from the Kiev power grid operator. Another power plant somewhere else had unexpectedly gone offline.
So they were ordered to keep producing power.
Exactly. They had to delay the test and keep the reactor running. And this is the critical conflict. These RBMK reactors were designed to run at a constant, steady output. They were unstable at low power or during shutdowns.
But the plant operators had no say in it. The grid operator in Kyiv called the shots. Quotas and power demands always came before safety procedures.
So the test is delayed for hours, and the night shift comes on, led by Anatoly Dyatlov. He, along with Alexander Akimov and a young operator named Leonid Toptunov, are now tasked with running this test under terrible conditions.
Because of the delay, they had to operate the reactor at a really low power level, something like 200 thermal megawatts, when the test was supposed to be run at over 700.
Way below the minimum safe operating level. And at that low power, the reactor core becomes what they call poisoned.
Okay, let's break that down. What does it mean for a reactor core to be poisoned?
So when the reactor's running, it produces all these byproducts. One of them is a gas called xenon-135. And xenon-135 is like a sponge for neutrons. It absorbs them and slows the nuclear reaction down.
To neutron poison.
Exactly. Normally, at high power, the neutrons burn off the xenon as fast as it's created. But at low power, the xenon builds up and starts choking the reactor, dragging the power down even further. They called it falling into an iodine pit.
And Dyatlov, the supervisor, is determined to get this test done. He's pushing them.
He is. So to fight this poisoning and get the power back up, the young operator Toptunov makes the single most fatal decision of the night.
He pulls out the control rods.
He pulls out almost all of them. Out of 167 control rods, which are what you use to slow down the reaction, he leaves only 9 in the core. The reactor is now like a car with no brakes, barreling downhill.
And they're getting all kinds of emergency signals and warnings from the computers.
And they ignore them. They are so focused on just completing the test that they break one safety rule after another. The reactor is now terrifyingly unstable.
And then, at 1.23 and 44 seconds in the morning, Akimov realizes they've completely lost control.
The power is spiking uncontrollably. He does the one thing he's trained to do in an absolute emergency. He hits the AZ5 button.
The big red button. Emergency shutdown.
The scram button. It's supposed to instantly drop all the control rods back into the core and stop the reaction cold.
But it did the exact opposite.
The exact opposite, because of a catastrophic secret design flaw in the RBMK reactor.
The graphite tips.
Graphite tips. To save money, the control rods were tipped with graphite, and graphite is a moderator. It actually speeds up the nuclear reaction for a split second before the absorbing part of the rod can get into the core.
So when he hit the shutdown button, it briefly created a massive power surge.
A catastrophic one. In seconds, the power surged to more than 10 times the reactor's normal output. 30,000 megawatts. The steam pressure was immense.
That just blew the whole thing apart.
It blew the 2,000-ton concrete lid, they called it Elena, right off the top of the reactor.
And witnesses said the sound was just horrifying.
Yeah, one described it as a low tone, like a human moan. Then a second, even bigger explosion. And even then, in the control room, they were in complete denial. They thought a water tank had ruptured. Their training said an RBMK reactor could not explode.
But outside, the real nightmare was just beginning. The firefighters arrived within minutes.
Lieutenants Pravik and Kibanok and their crews, absolute heroes who ran straight into hell.
And they had no idea what they were running into.
None at all. They thought it was a standard roof fire. They climbed onto the roof of the adjacent Unit 3, right next to the gaping, glowing hole of Unit 4.
And they're literally kicking these blocks of black material off the roof.
Not knowing that those blocks were chunks of pure graphite from the exposed reactor core, emitting thousands of rotons of radiation per hour, a lethal dose in minutes.
And almost immediately they start getting sick. Nausea, vomiting, disorientation.
Acute radiation sickness. Pravik, right before he collapsed, he told his friends to tell his wife to close the windows at home. He was trying to protect her from the very thing that was killing him.
It's just heartbreaking. And at the hospital in Pripyat, the doctors are completely unprepared.
Dr. Belikhan, he's expecting burn victims, trauma. Not this. The men are vomiting, their skin is turning this strange dark tan. He diagnoses them with gas poisoning.
They just had no frame of reference for what was happening. We need to be clear about the numbers here. The emergency limit for a nuclear worker was about 30 rem.
Right. These firefighters received doses of 600 rem or more. It was a death sentence.
And it wasn't just them. It was a beautiful Saturday morning. Kids were outside playing in Pripyat.
Playing in invisible clouds of radioactive fallout, getting exposed to doses that were thousands of times higher than normal. The whole city was already a death trap.
And while all this is happening on the ground, the political machine in Moscow starts to grind into motion, and its first priority is secrecy and control. This brings us to Chapter 8, High Commission.
Mikhail Gorbachev gets the first report at about 5 a.m., but the report is a lie. It says the reactor is intact.
So he's not worried. He remembers being told that the RBMK was no more dangerous than a samovar, a tea kettle.
Right. It was a politically motivated assurance he'd been given for years, so he just approves a standard state commission to go investigate. He doesn't grasp the scale at all.
That commission is led by Boris Sherbina, and when they arrive, they're hit with this wall of reality. They can see the destroyed building from the road. They know they've been lied to.
But even then, at their first meeting, the instinct is to downplay it. They're dismissing calls for an evacuation as alarmist. They're worried about causing a panic.
Until one man stands up and tells the truth.
Serafim Vorobev, the civil defense chief, he reports that his instruments are reading over 250 rotons an hour. And that's only because his equipment couldn't measure any higher. It was off the charts.
That's when reality starts to sink in. And then they get the medical reports from the hospital. The staff have what they're calling a radiation tan.
Their skin is turning dark brown. It's a sign they've received a dose that's 3 or 4 times the lethal limit. There's no more denying it.
And then, late Saturday night, the reactor explodes again.
3 more powerful explosions. They light up the night sky, throwing more radioactive material into the air. That's the final straw. An expert named Armin Abajian just demands they evacuate immediately.
He's pleading with them, right? He says children are still out playing in the streets.
People were hanging laundered linen out to dry, and the atmosphere was radioactive. But the senior medical officer is still resisting, quoting some outdated rule book.
The bureaucratic inertia is just stunning.
It is. Finally, Sherpina, the head of the commission, he's convinced. He calls the premier in Moscow, Rushkov, and tells him they're still holding weddings in Pripyat.
And Rezkov makes the call. Evacuate. Tomorrow morning. Tell people to just take the bare necessities. That's almost 24 hours after the first explosion.
Which leads us right into the next chapter, Chapter 9, Exodus, the evacuation itself.
And it turns out the Ukrainian Prime Minister, Lyashko, had already started getting buses and trains ready. He just had this gut feeling, a foreboding of danger.
Even though the Moscow loyal officials had called him an alarmist for it, his instincts probably saved a lot of time.
But the information blockade is still in full effect. The KGB is still sending reports to Kyiv, minimizing everything, using faulty equipment that can't measure the true radiation levels.
They're more concerned with controlling the narrative than protecting the people. And you see that most clearly in the story of the firefighters' wives.
Oh, this is just devastating. Mila Inatenko and the other wives, they're at the hospital, refusing to leave their husbands.
So a doctor tricks them. She tells them to go home and get some clean clothes for the men because their uniforms are radioactive.
And while they're gone?
While they're gone, the men are put on planes and secretly flown to a special hospital in Moscow. The wives come back to a completely empty ward. It's an act of profound, cruel deception.
Just to maintain control. And the evacuation of Pripyat on that Sunday is surreal.
There's film footage of it. And it shows kids playing soccer, people getting married, eating ice cream. And right next to them, you see police in full chemical suits and armored vehicles spraying down the street.
It's like 2 different realities existing at the same time. The officially enforced denial and the horrifying truth right in front of them.
And you can actually see the radiation on the film itself, these little white flashes and sparks. It's the radioactive particles literally burning into the camera lens.
And they tell everyone they'll only be gone for 3 days.
A total lie. One person on a departing train later said it felt like they were leaving the old, clean world we used to know into our new poisoned age, the age of Chernobyl.
Once the city is empty, the focus shifts to containment. Chapter 10, Taming the Reactor.
And the initial efforts are just chaotic. Plokhy describes seeing these high-ranking officials in expensive suits, literally digging sand with shovels to try and fill bags.
The system was so broken it couldn't even organize getting sandbags to the site for 2 days.
But then you have the incredible heroism of the helicopter pilots, General Antoshkin's crews. They're given the job of flying over the open reactor and dropping sand and boron into it.
An unimaginable task. They made over 100 flights on the first day alone.
And every time they opened the helicopter hatch to drop a load, the cabin was flooded with radiation. The levels would spike to 1,800 rangens per hour. They were flying into a death trap over and over again.
They eventually dropped almost 5,000 tons of material onto the core, but then the crisis gets even worse.
Yeah, they detect neutron radiation, which means the nuclear reaction is still happening. It's still alive. And this is when the fear of the China syndrome becomes very, very real.
Okay, let's be super clear about what this means. The China syndrome.
So the fear was that the core, which was now superheated and weighed down by all that sand and lead they'd dropped on it, would melt through the concrete floor of the reactor building.
It would just keep melting its way down through the earth.
And if that molten mass hit the large pools of water that were in the basement water they had pumped in during the initial firefighting, it would cause a steam explosion.
A second explosion, but much, much bigger.
Potentially hundreds of times bigger. An explosion that could have contaminated most of Europe and made it uninhabitable. The temperature of the core was rising 100 degrees Celsius every day. They were in a race against time.
And while this existential threat is unfolding, what is the Soviet government telling the world?
Nothing. For days, complete silence. They finally admit something happened on Monday night, April 28th. Hours after Sweden had already detected high radiation levels and figured out it was coming from the USSR.
And the announcement is just this tiny, bland statement from the TASS news agency. One of the atomic reactors has been damaged.
It's a masterclass in understatement, and that deceit leads to maybe the most infamous decision of the whole disaster, the May Day parade in Kyiv.
I still can't believe this happened. The wind had shifted, and a radioactive cloud was heading straight for Kyiv, and Moscow orders them to go ahead with the parade.
It was about projecting an image of normalcy and control to the world. The Ukrainian leader, Shchybitsky, he knew the danger. He was furious. But Gorbachev basically threatened him.
If you don't hold the demonstration, you can say goodbye to the party.
That was the message. So they did it. The party leadership stood on the podium, bareheaded, while hundreds of thousands of their own citizens, including children, marched below them in a radioactive cloud.
It's just evil. The state sacrificing its own people for the sake of an image.
And for many people in Ukraine, that was the moment the Soviet Union lost all legitimacy. They learned about the real danger not from their own government, but from listening to forbidden foreign radio broadcasts like Voice of America. The trust was broken forever.
So back at the plant, they're still desperately trying to stop the China syndrome.
They're pursuing two plans at once. One idea from Legasov is to install filters to try and clean the radioactive water in the basement. That didn't really work.
And the other plan is huge.
Colossal. It was championed by a scientist named Yevgeny Velikov. His idea was to bring in thousands of miners to dig tunnels under the reactor.
And do what?
And install a massive refrigeration system to freeze the ground solid with liquid nitrogen, create a frozen shield to stop the molten core from ever reaching the water table.
An incredible undertaking. And all this is happening while the world is watching. The international pressure is building.
So the Soviets are forced to let the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Hans Blix, come for a visit.
And the whole thing is completely stage managed.
Totally. They fly him in by helicopter. They told him it was to avoid the contaminated roads.
But the real reason was so his Geiger counter wouldn't pick up the radioactive dust on the roads, which would prove they were lying about containment.
And there's another secret. The helicopter route also meant he wouldn't see the giant, top-secret Duga radar complex from the ground. Gorbachev himself approved the flight path. Military secrecy was still the top priority.
So Blix gives this optimistic report to the world, saying the Russians have it under control. The Soviet deception worked. For a little while.
But the cleanup itself required a staggering human sacrifice. This is the story of the liquidators.
Over 600,000 people, mostly military reservists, were sent into the zone.
They were motivated by this sense of duty, the Soviet slogan, who if not we. The miners who dug those tunnels under the reactor worked in 3-hour shifts in unbearable heat and radiation. True heroes.
And the personal cost is just. It's captured so perfectly in the story of Lyudmila Inatenko, the firefighter's wife. She follows her dying husband, Vasyl, to that hospital in Moscow.
And she's 6 months pregnant. She bribes a nurse to let her in, and she lies to the doctors, hiding her pregnancy because she knows they'd never let her near him.
Because his body itself is radioactive.
Intensely. The nurses had to change his sheets 3 times a day because the radioactive dust from his skin was contaminating the room. And she stays with him, taking care of him as his body literally falls apart.
He dies an agonizing death, and that her baby is born 2 months later.
The baby, who she called Ignatia, lives for only 4 hours. The doctors found the baby's liver was destroyed by cirrhosis, and it had congenital heart defects. It had absorbed the lethal dose of radiation from its father through its mother.
That story just says everything about the human cost.
It does. And after all that, the official accountability was, of course, a show trial. In 1987, they put the plant managers on trial. Barukhanov, Fomin, and Dyatlov.
The scapegoats.
The scapegoats. They were blamed for violating safety rules, for hiding information. Barukhanov got 10 years. But the verdict was designed to protect the Soviet nuclear industry as a whole.
They couldn't admit the reactor itself was flawed. They had to blame the operators.
As Barukhanov himself said later, they needed a verdict that showed the world that Soviet science was the best. It was all politics.
But the real tragedy of accountability is the story of Valery Legasov, the scientist who led the commission.
Yeah. He gave this incredibly honest and detailed report about the accident at the IAEA conference in Vienna. The world praised him for his candor.
But when he got back to Moscow, he was treated like a traitor.
He was. The party felt he had revealed too many secrets, that he'd pushed the glasnost envelope too far. They denied him the country's highest honors. He was politically destroyed.
And he lived with this incredible guilt. He later confessed that he hadn't even told the whole truth in Vienna.
He'd hidden the biggest secret of all, the fatal design flaw of the RBMK reactor, the graphite tips, the fact that the system itself had engineered the disaster.
And that burden, combined with the radiation he'd been exposed to, was just too much.
On the second anniversary of the evacuation, April 27th, 1988, he committed suicide. He left behind audio tapes finally explaining the reactor's design flaws. His death forced the Soviet Union to finally admit the truth.
A final, terrible indictment of the system's secrecy. And that brings us to the ultimate legacy of Chernobyl in a post-Soviet Ukraine. The cover-up didn't just expose lies, it lit a fire under the Ukrainian independence movement.
Absolutely. You had Ukrainian writers and poets who used to praise nuclear power as a symbol of Soviet strength. Now they became fierce anti-nuclear crusaders. The fight against Chernobyl became the fight for national liberation. They called it eco-nationalism.
And it was grassroots journalism that really broke the official story open. The work of Alla Yaroshinskaya.
She was a journalist who ran for office on an environmental platform. And she discovered that the government had this secret map showing massive contamination in a district called Narodichi, and they had just kept it secret. They never told the people who lived there.
She got the map and exposed the whole thing at the Congress of People's Deputies in Moscow. It was a huge blow to the central government's credibility.
It was. And in 1990, the Ukrainian parliament voted to close the Chernobyl plant for good. But then it became this international political football.
Because Ukraine needed money to shut it down and find replacement power.
So they used it as leverage. Some people called it environmental blackmail. They basically traded the closure of Chernobyl for security guarantees, like the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, where they gave up their nuclear weapons, and for billions in international aid.
And they dragged their feet on closing the last reactor for years.
Right up until December 15th, 2000. It took almost a decade after independence to finally shut the place down.
And the physical legacy is still there. That massive new shelter, the Arch, wasn't finished until more than 25 years after the disaster.
And the contamination will be there for thousands of years. Cesium-137 will linger for a couple of centuries, but plutonium-239, which they found all the way in Sweden, has a half-life of 24,000 years.
So the exclusion zone will be uninhabitable for at least 20,000 years.
Basically forever in human terms.
And this story from the past has such huge relevance for today, doesn't it?
It really does, because most of the new nuclear reactors being built today are not in the West. They're in China, Russia, India, parts of Africa.
And Plokhy's book leaves you with this really chilling question. Have those lessons about safety and transparency really been learned?
Or are we seeing the same old pattern? Authoritarian governments pushing for rapid growth, prioritizing national prestige and secrecy over the safety of their own people.
So to wrap it all up, Plokhy's book shows that Chernobyl wasn't just a technological failure. It was the predictable outcome of a political system that valued secrets and quotas more than human lives.
And its fallout, both literal and political, helped bring that whole system crashing down. It created a blueprint for how citizens can demand the truth and force massive political change.
Which I think leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. We always focus on the physics and the engineering of nuclear power. But the real lesson of Chernobyl is about governance. It's about transparency and accountability.
And given the rise of autocratic leaders around the world today, you have to ask, are we really doing enough to make sure the next Chernobyl isn't just waiting to happen?
A really important question to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Serhii Plokhy's Chernobyl. We hope you feel a little more informed.